Hello, this is Prismatic, and today I'm going to show you how you can automate and record OSC using Ableton with this Max for Live device I created called OSC Automator. It basically generates Ableton parameters for you that correspond with whatever other visual software you're using, so you can automate it in real time. In this case, I'm using TouchDesigner. I'm also going to cover how you can set this up with Synesthesia, but really it would work with any sort of software that accepts OSC, whether that's Resolume, Unity, Unreal, P5.js, processing, etc. I think it's a really powerful system because Ableton has such amazing flexible automation controls, and you can combine that with any real-time rendering software that you want. So you get kind of the best of both worlds of traditional sort of non-real-time automation environments and really powerful real-time software like TouchDesigner. And you can really easily synchronize your animations to audio in Ableton. I've had a lot of fun working on this and using it over the years to create music videos, so I hope you find it useful. Here's a little outline of the tutorial. First, we've got this intro section. After this, I'm going to show you a little demo and talk about the background story. Then I'm going to cover the Max for Live device in depth, including installation, a full walkthrough of all the features, and how you can generate parameters for TouchDesigner, Synesthesia, OSC input with the Learn feature, and manually creating parameters. Then I'm going to walk through the process for creating a music video by recreating this TouchDesigner demo. So that includes setting up the Ableton set, automating parameters, recording OSC input, syncing videos, and recording the output, either with OBS Studio in real time or non-real time with TouchDesigner. Now I want to show you a quick demo. I created this sort of basic patch in TouchDesigner, and I'm automating it in Ableton to this track Can't Keep Staying by SH Orchid and Bean Hollow. I'm also going to make this project file available for download.
Can't keep playing. Don't make me say it.
Yeah, so there it is. Pretty basic, but it kind of shows all the main features that we can do with this. Later on in the video, I'm going to recreate this all from scratch so you can get a sense of how to use this tool. Now I want to tell you the background of how I ended up developing this tool. When I first got into visuals, I was really into using the leap motion to control the visuals with hand motion. I was using this interface system I developed in Max MSP to control the other software. So I could read in the leap motion data here and then send it out over OSC to control whatever the software was generating the visual, whether that's processing or TouchDesigner. This was pretty fun and very expressive, but there was a big limitation in that I had to get the perfect take. So when I went to record music videos, I had to do like 20 takes to get the perfect hand movement. This just got me thinking, might there be some way that I could record the OSC output from this Max interface and then edit it and play it back in real time, so I could dial in the final product without needing to get one perfect take. And this led me on a big quest. I tried a bunch of different potential software. There's Vezzer, but it's Mac only, can't really record. The Wizard of OSC, which is really cool software, and you can record stuff, but there isn't a nice graphical editor. There's also a CS Score, which I think technically might be able to do this, but I found it pretty janky, to be honest. There's Chatain, which is really cool, highly recommend it, but couldn't figure out a way to record. Side note, I have this Notion database with all this software that I'd sort of collected related to creating real-time visuals. And there's this whole section in here called Controller. All of these are OSC controller applications. So there's a lot out there. At some point I might make a video where I kind of walk through this whole list and explain them all. One day I saw my friend using Ableton to record automation, where he was using a MIDI controller and recording the values live into this automation track. That was kind of an epiphany moment for me where I realized, like, wait a minute, maybe I could get the OSC values into a Max for Live device and record it as automation in the way that you would anything else in Ableton. I got a basic plugin working, used it to create some music videos, and over the next couple of years, I sort of honed and polished the setup to the point where it is today. The more I started using this system, the more I realized that this is super powerful because it's fully integrated with whatever music you have playing. There's also other features in Ableton that are really handy for creating music videos with this. Like you can use macros, you can use other Max for Live devices like envelope MIDI. There's a lot to get into here, which I'll explain more later. One thing you might be wondering is why not just use the animation comp? The animation comp works really well for some use cases, But there's no easy way to sync this with audio, and I think that the automation controls in Ableton are a little nicer. But I will say, if you're just trying to do an automation that isn't synced to music, I would probably just go with the animation comp. Another thing that people have asked me is why not just use TDAbleton? Like, can't you get all that information from TDAbleton without this extra Max for Live patch? So here's a little comparison just to clear it up. TDAbleton is a fantastic tool, and I still use it for other things. There's just kind of different use cases that these are good for. The key difference is that OSC Automator can generate Ableton parameters to use based on the TouchDesigner component. So if we pull up this set, all of these parameters have been generated based on the custom parameters coming from TouchDesigner, and I'll explain that more later. But this isn't really something you can do easily without this plugin. You could try to create dummy animation and link it with TDAbleton, but it's not going to be this streamlined. OSC Automator is better for recording and creating music videos specifically, and it has a really streamlined and feature-rich interface for that specific purpose. TDAbleton, on the other hand, is really good for real-time control and really comprehensive integration with your set. You can pull in whatever information you want from Ableton and hook that up to whatever you want in TouchDesigner. So this is how you install OSC Automator. When you download the files, you're going to get a zip file that has this folder in it, and there are 3 files related to this device. You want to drag all of these into the correct Max for Live folder. On Windows, it looks like this. On Mac, it looks like this. So here's my folder on this Windows machine. I'm going to highlight all of these and copy over here. So now in Ableton, we can go for Max for Live, Max Audio Effect, and OSC Automator should show up, and you can drag it in. This device is a copy of OSC Automator that I created for the TouchDesigner example that we're going to get into later, and I'm going to use this to sort of walk through the main features. So for now, I'm going to hide this. So this Perform tab is the main area that you're going to be working with. At the top, you have basic OSC settings, input port, output port. You want to make sure that these match what you're sending and receiving in the other software. There's also output FPS, which determines how fast the automation will be sent over OSC. You can usually just use this at 60, and it's been fine in my experience, but if you're ever running into CPU issues, you can turn it down to 30, and it will send half the messages and reduce that CPU load. Then we have this I/O section to determine what we're sending and receiving. Parameter I/O, this is like really the core functionality of the plugin. This in toggle determines whether OSC messages coming from the other software can update these parameters. So watch this dimmer button here. I'm going to go change it in TouchDesigner, and it is updating in Ableton. The out toggle determines whether these parameters output over OSC to the other software. So if I change dimmer here, it also updates in TouchDesigner. So you can start to see we have this bi-directional communication between the two pieces of software. One thing to note is that when I send a message from TouchDesigner or anything else into Ableton and update it, this is not going to then output over OSC because that would create a feedback loop that we want to avoid. The last toggle here is called through, and it's useful for a very particular use case. Here's a little diagram that shows how OSC Automator can be used. So most of the time, you're probably just going to have OSC Automator and the instrument doing this sort of bi-directional communication. And that's what I have here between TouchDesigner and Ableton. But sometimes you might also want to use an OSC controller that is controlling the instrument, and then you would want OSC Automator as a sort of middleman, where the controller is sending to OSC Automator is sending to the instrument. An example is like, say you're using TouchDesigner to control Unreal Engine, or you're using TouchOSC to control Synesthesia. It can be really handy to have OSC Automator in the middle of this, and then you can record the control signal of the controller while you're still controlling the instrument with those values. So here's a quick example. Let's pretend I created this max patch to control TouchDesigner, but now I want to use OSC Automator as a middleman so I can record the values, right? And when I send this, it's updating that dimmer value here correctly. But you'll notice that it is not then passed through to TouchDesigner. And that's because of what I mentioned earlier. When these input values come in, they don't actually output over OSC because that would create feedback. If I turn on this through value here, you can see that it actually passes through onto TouchDesigner. And one thing to note is that it actually outputs the raw value. You can see in Ableton, the dimmer is limited to 0 to 1, but here I'm going up to like 30, and the 30 is actually passed through onto TouchDesigner. So that's something you should be aware of. These ranges still need to be correct in order to record these values. If they're outside of the range of the value, it's just going to be capped at 1 in this case. You could have a full controller for TouchDesigner that's being passed through OSC Automator and Ableton, you can record those values as you're performing and then go back and play it back again and edit the automation to really dial it in. Next, we have this time in and out section. This allows you to synchronize the timeline of Ableton with the other software. I've mostly used this with TouchDesigner, but you could also find a way to incorporate this with other software too. This OSC Manager component is how you use TouchDesigner with OSC Automator. I'm going to get more into it later, but for now we're just going to talk about how it works with this time feature. So you can see if I have this toggle to output time, and I start playing the Ableton set, that is being received in TouchDesigner, and you'll get both smooth time and just raw time. And this can be used to synchronize video playback, which I will cover later in the tutorial. So the other thing you can do is actually use the TouchDesigner timeline to control the playhead in Ableton. So if I turn on time in here, and I've got output time in TouchDesigner, if I now play, you'll see the playhead actually changes and the automation updates here. You can use this feature to export your automated video from TouchDesigner in non-real time, which is really nice because you can get a super high quality output, and I'm going to explain that more later. So then we have this final section down here. This filter params feature is one of my favorite things about this. You can search for different parameters and they'll pop up there. This is really handy when you have more complex systems and you're controlling like 50 parameters, so you don't have to like search around for it. So you can get into this nice sort of flow state where you're just like, okay, I want to work with noise. Let me search for those, open the automation for it, write in some curves, etc. And then finally you have these param actions. Update will output all these current values in case the other software becomes unsynchronized. And default will set all these parameters to default, which I don't really want to do. Okay, so now I want to talk about these parameter components. On the right is the label. Sometimes it gets cut off, but if you hover over it, it will show the full thing. You can also click and see the name in this automation menu here. Then you have these number boxes. That's the actual Ableton parameter. You can click and drag these to use this as sort of a controller. You can also click to see the automation here and start editing. And anything you can do with other Ableton parameters, you can do with these. Then you have this M button, which is interesting. You should map your macros and modulators to this button instead of the main button. And this allows you to record the mapping output as automation. So in Ableton, there's this sort of weird limitation. Macro values can't be recorded into an automation lane. So I have these macros here, and let's say I want to map this rotate speed, right? If I then start playing around with this, and then maybe I want to automate this macro, right? We'll get more into using macros in the future. So now the speed is going to be controlled by that automation, but there's no way for me to also automate this or record that into an envelope. It just really limits you. If I unmap and instead map this little M button, now you'll see something interesting. So now when I hit record, you can actually record the output of that macro into an automation lane, which is super powerful, and you can't really do this in Ableton otherwise. Now you can sort of mix and match the power of macros and automation, right? Where you can map a macro to a parameter, use that for part of the song, record it into the automation, turn the macro off, do manual automation for the rest of it. You get the idea. I'll get more into that process later when I do the full demo with this example. Okay, so then finally we have these individual in-out buttons for each parameter. So right now I can control TouchDesigner with dimmer. If I turn this off, this isn't going to output even if the rest do. Likewise with this in button on and the main in button on, I can change the dimmer here and update that parameter in Ableton. If I turn this off, that is not going to update. One other thing to note is that you can hold shift and toggle all of the parameters at once. This just allows maximum flexibility where you can get really specific about which parameters you want to record, which ones you want to output. This comes in especially handy when you're trying to record parameters. Like something I'll do is I turn off all the inputs except the one that I want to record, and then I might just change that one in TouchDesigner and record the output while the rest stays the same. I'll show an example of that recording process later. Alright, so that covers the main perform view and the parameters. Now I want to get into this setup tab, and for that I'm going to go back to the stock OSC Automator option. This is how you actually generate new parameters, and you need to edit the patch in order to do that. So if you open up this window, you'll see this new setup area pop up. Before I continue, I just want to show you some of the behind the scenes here. Really the heart and soul of this whole system is this JavaScript patch right here. This handles all the generation of these parameters as well as managing their state. filtering them, etc. So here's a little behind the scenes of how I coded this. I wrote it in TypeScript and then transpiled it to this JS version. And this is really nice because you can create custom interfaces to define a lot of these built-in Max objects. Working with JavaScript in Max can be really powerful, especially with Max for Live devices. So I might make a whole tutorial about this workflow at some point if people are interested. Before I get into setup, I just want to mention it's always good to save this device as a new device before you're going to generate any parameters. I'll just call this OSC Automator demo. That way you keep this original clean OSC Automator device as a template and you can branch off from there. As of now, there are 4 main options to generate parameters. You can do it for a TouchDesigner component. For a Synesthesia scene, you can also learn from OSC input, and you can manually add parameters to any of these other options. And I'm going to cover all 4 of those in depth. But first, I want to tell you about this param scale option at the top. This is a really important setting to understand, and it has to do with the ranges of these Ableton parameters. So in Ableton, the range of an automation lane is fixed, and you can't automate values outside of that range. And this is probably the biggest limitation of using this system to automate visual software, because usually when you're automating visual software, you have unlimited range. Like in the Automation COMP or in After Effects, you can set the value to whatever you want. But in this case, we're sort of boxed into this min-max range. So there are 2 ways to handle this. In normalized mode, the range of these parameters is always going to be 0 to 1, and it's expecting the receiving software to then scale up that value to the correct range. Whereas in raw mode, it's going to be the actual range of the full parameter, and it's expecting the receiver software to just take in the value as is. To explain this setting more, I'm going to use this TouchDesigner example, which I've shown before. I'm going to load this JSON file that I've already outputted, and I'll explain how to do that later. All of these parameters of this component have different ranges, right? Like this one goes up to 2, some of them go up to 360. When I create the parameters for it in normalized mode, all of these Ableton parameters are still going to have the range 0 to 1. But you'll notice when I change them, this actually goes from 0 to 360. And that is because this normalized setting has been set. So it's expecting a value from 0 to 1. If I change this to raw, on the other hand, and I go back, this is just going to go from 0 to 1. So let's leave this at raw and now change this param scale to raw and recreate the parameters. Now these are all going to have the full range of the parameters, and TouchDesigner is going to expect the exact value, not something between 0 and 1. So in general, I would recommend sticking with normalized and handling the scaling in the other software. It just creates more flexibility. These are going to be 0 to 1, and you can adjust the range in the other software to change how much range that parameter will have. Raw is good if you've got really solid ranges that don't need to change, or if it's more intuitive to use the actual parameter value instead of a normalized value, or if the other software doesn't support normalized input. Okay, so with that covered, I'm going to get into these 4 different generation methods, starting with TouchDesigner. So now I want to properly introduce this OSC Manager component that will also be available for download. You kind of need this component when you're using OSC Automator. But I will say this component is also useful outside of this context. So when you drag a target component into this parameter, it will now handle all incoming and outgoing OSC for you. So it can handle parameter input and automatically update these parameter values, and it can also output parameter changes over OSC. Here's a quick demo. It uses an address prefix that's based on the name of the target component, and then you can just put in the name of whatever parameter you want to control and start to control that parameter with any OSC-compatible software. And I'm not using OSC Automator here at all. This is just directly from Max to TouchDesigner. The other thing you can do is output from TouchDesigner to other software using this output parameter changes and output time features. So I've got Max set up to receive on the same port that TouchDesigner is outputting to. And with this output parameter changes on, I can go in here and it will output and be received in Max. The other thing I can do is output time. This is going to become more relevant later on. This is made specifically for OSC Automator. It lets you control the timeline of Ableton using this special address. One other thing to note is this block OSC feedback feature. If I input here and change dimmer, you'll notice I'm not receiving any of those changes for dimmer. And that's because that might create a feedback loop. So I added this system to block it for a particular number of seconds, and 0.1 tends to work well. All right, I'm just going to cover the rest of these settings. So component, we know that. Address prefix, I would just leave this at the default expression. Only include capitalized pages. This is on by default. It means that you can choose which custom pages are going to be part of this OSC API. This is kind of handy. Usually I have a lowercase setup page with parameters that I don't want to be automated and I don't really want to be set via OSC. They're just something you want to set up at the start. And then any custom pages with a capital letter at the start will be part of that OSC API. Another feature to note is this create parameter expressions pulse. So if I come up here and click that button, you'll see that all of these are set to an expression and they're referencing this OSC input chop here. And the reason for that is that expressions are more efficient than updating via the Python script. That's how the input is handled by default, is with this Python script. But if you're running into CPU issues or you want to really optimize, you can set these to expressions and cut down on some CPU time. One more little feature is this output current parameter values. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it will output all of the parameter values to the other software. Okay, so now we have this section specifically for working with OSC Automator, and there's a little pulse that will output JSON for OSC Automator. So if I click that, that actually just wrote a file to this output path. By default, it uses the name of the component that you're targeting, and I would just leave it at that, and it will save it to the same project folder. So if I pull up the project folder, you'll see this example JSON was saved here. And then once you have that JSON, it's really easy to generate parameters to control the component. You just load the file, double click, load it here, and create params. I already did it, so it's not going to have any change, but that's how it works. Another cool feature you can do is this output JSON on comp change. So if I turn this on, and let's just add a sort of dummy parameter here called testing. That should have now updated our output file. And if I go back to our plugin and recreate params, you'll see a new testing parameter pop up. So that makes it really easy to keep these synchronized. So now if we go back to our Ableton set, we've got this plugin all set up and ready to control our component. You can start to play with these parameters and automate them here. All right, so next up we have Synesthesia scenes, and you want to load the scene JSON file of whatever scene you're working with. So I'm going to use this hex array scene as a demo. It's kind of one of the classic built-in scenes. This is the location of the scene JSON for this scene. You can go to Program Files, Synesthesia, Release, and then you'll see all the built-in scenes. Or of course, if you have your own custom scene folder, you can use any of that. So now if we open up this file and hit Create Params, we should see all of these pop up for our scene. So once you have these parameters generated, you just want to make sure that the ports are set up properly to match. So I'm going to go to the OSC section and settings. You will need a pro license to access these features, but these look good. Then we want to turn output control values to output normalized values, and you should leave control address format to scene specific addresses. So once that's all set up, we should now have two-way communication between the plugin and Synesthesia. So I can change these parameters here and Synesthesia will update. I can also change here and OSC Automator will update. And of course, I could start to automate some of these parameters and get a nice animation going through the timeline. So one other thing I want to mention is this include meta toggle. If I create parameters again, you'll see now we actually have all the meta controls created as well. So now you can automate all these controls in addition to whatever scene controls you're using. The third option is to learn from OSC input. This is useful for software that doesn't have this structure to build from. So I have a little max patch to demonstrate. If I turn on this learn feature and now I can change these, you'll see 3 items have been registered and I can edit them here and see the addresses. Now when I create params, it's going to create based on those addresses it received. And it's going to output to the same address that it received on. So I have this patch set up to print those messages. If I go here and start to change these, you'll see example 1, even though the label is just the last part of that address. The other part about this learn feature is that you can actually specify the min, max, and default of each parameter. So I'm going to send these in here, and now there's 6 items. And you'll see I have these new addresses. It has to be in this exact format of /def, /max, /min for it to work. But now if I turn this to raw and create params, you'll see that 3 has a minimum of 10, max 20, and if I set it to default, it'll go to 15. So if you're building your own custom OSC controller in something like Max, you can use that to your advantage. Then finally, we have this option to manually add parameters. So let's say your other software like can't send OSC at all, and you just want to manually build out an interface. You can do that. So you can say my param, min, max, default, and add it in here and start to control it there. I'm going to add another one. And something to note about this is that these params won't be cleared if you create from another source. So if I now create parameters from our Synesthesia scene, these 2 custom parameters that we added are going to stay there. That means you can manually add parameters to any of these options and they will stick around even when you recreate the other parameters. If you do want to get rid of them, you can just unlock the patch and delete them here. Now I want to walk you through the whole process of creating a music video with this tool. And I'm basically just going to recreate that demo I showed you earlier with the TouchDesigner patch. So the first step is to import your song into Ableton. I'm going to use this song Can't Keep Staying. I'm going to turn off warp. And now you need to set the BPM properly. You might just know it for your song, but the way that I tend to do that is using this tool tap BPM. So I'm going to play it. So it seems like 107 is right. And then you can kind of go in and see if you got it correct based on how this lines up here. The next step is to choose the part of the song that you want to automate to. You might be using the whole song. In this case, I'm going to just use this first chorus here. So I'm just going to get rid of the rest of the track. We'll drag this over here and try to line this up properly so that the downbeat is going where it should be. And now I'm going to set this loop. And now we have this part of the song that I'm going to automate to. So this part is really important and it's just something you need to know. You need to add a locator at the start of the section that you want to automate to. So I'm going to call this start, but this actually needs to be the first locator that you create. So if I delete that locator, I add another one here called end and recreate this one called start. This is not going to work properly. It actually needs to be the first locator that you created because of how Ableton outputs that information behind the scenes. So I'm going to delete both of these and again, create this start locator. And this is important for when you're trying to synchronize the timeline of Ableton with other software, which I'm going to be doing in this example. This tells Ableton where to offset the incoming and outgoing time, so that this right here is 0 and everything above that will start counting up. One thing to note is that you might already have an Ableton set with a ton of stuff in it that you're using to produce a track. In that case, I generally would recommend bouncing it all to just one audio file and doing this in a new track to keep the CPU usage low. Okay, so now we've set up the song. I'm going to create a new audio track and go and find our OSC Automator plugin here. So now I'm going to set this up to control our TouchDesigner patch. Let's open this up, load the same file we've worked with before. I'm going to stick with normalized and create parameters. Now I'm going to close this, and if we open up our TouchDesigner example, this should now be working to set these parameters. So the first thing I like to do is sort of set up the parameters here. So I'm going to make sure that output parameter changes is on for OSC Manager. Now when I change these parameters, you should see it updating in Ableton. And I'm just going to get this look dialed in a bit. So let's bring the camera out. Let's turn dilate off. Let's increase the speed a bit and reduce this to like 0.02. Now what we can do is actually record these values as starting points of the automation here. So to do that, make sure that this automation arm button is turned on, and then you can click record. Let's go to our OSC Manager and output current values. Now you'll notice that these all have been initialized with correct automation for their starting value. This is just really handy to sort of make sure that these are going to remain stable over time. That trick is really useful, especially if you have like a preset system in TouchDesigner or whatever other system you're using. You can set your preset here, record over here, update all the values, and now you're good to go with all of these automation lanes initialized with the preset value. All right, so now that I've got that set up, I'm going to hide this and go to our top viewer so we can just focus on the output and Ableton. So let's listen to the track again. I'm noticing a big snare sound, so I want to automate something to that. I'm going to do the camera rotate Y and kind of make it jump back and forth on the snare. So I'm going to create little automation points at all of the snares, which happen halfway between these measures. Now I'm going to sort of flip these so that it will rotate back and forth.
Can't keep playing.
To make this more interesting, I'm going to hold Option and curve it so it has kind of a head start here. That's one of the nice features of Ableton, is that you can totally curve this and change what sort of action you're getting. Now that I have these, I'm going to highlight this and just hit Control D to duplicate it for the rest of this section. And I'm going to copy this one more time to cover the beginning of the track here. Now if I play it again, you can see we're getting the desired effect there. Now I want to show you how you can incorporate MIDI and macros to really create a powerful setup. I have some MIDI tracks for this part of the song that are already created that I'm going to drag into here. This defines the kick and snare pattern as well as this little synth pattern throughout this part of the song. I'm going to drag these up to be next to the audio waveform. Okay, so now we've got this MIDI, I want to set it up so that we can control these parameters with an envelope generated by the MIDI. The first step for that is to put this device into a group with Control G or Command G. Now you can access these macros over here. What I like to do is create a macro for each component of the song that I want to automate to. So we've got our kick, we've got our snare. I'm going to add synth here as well. You could even add vocal. Now check this out. If I go to this MIDI tab here, I'm going to delete these stock plugins that I have added, and I'm going to search for drum rack and drop this in here. Now you'll notice these are getting triggered by the input MIDI. So now that we have this drum rack, we can add this MIDI envelope plugin to each of these individual notes. And now you can map this MIDI envelope to whatever you want in Ableton. This is another really handy Max for Live device that we have access to. So if I play again, it triggers a little envelope when the kick is hit. So I'm going to click map here, go back to our audio and click kick. Now when I play, the kick is being mapped to that envelope, and you can customize that. You can change the attack, decay, sustain, release. Honestly, I think this looks about good as is, so I'm going to leave it. The other thing I'm going to do here is add another envelope MIDI to our snare, and let's click map again, go back here and click on our snare. So now we have, so now that this is set up, this becomes really powerful because you can start to experiment with these different elements with this mapping feature. Let's say I want to increase noise speed with the kick. I can click on this M and map to the kick, and now the particles will speed up on the kick. I want to increase that maybe to like 0.5 as the minimum. That's the other nice thing with this macro system, is that you have this nice macro mappings UI where you can adjust the range. I'm going to drop that lower. Anyways, you get the idea. You can start to experiment with this in a really flexible, non-destructive way. Something that's kind of useful to do is, like, I know I want to modulate noise amplitude to the kick, so you can kind of figure out a good minimum and maximum value here before you do the mapping. Maybe like 0.3 to 0.6 or something would look good. So now if I go to map again, I click on this M for mapping, and I map it to the kick. We know that 0.3 and 0.6 is going to look pretty good here. All right, the next thing I want to do is map something to this synth MIDI. So I'm going to go in here, get rid of these, and again, let's add our envelope MIDI plugin. That looks about good. So now I want to click map here, go back to our device, map it to our synth. Let's turn down that attack so it's just immediate. Now I'm going to map dilate mix to that synth. I think that looks kind of cool to have that effect coming in on the synth. So another cool device that we can use that you might want to know about is envelope follower. So I'm going to search for that here and drag that into our main track. Let's get rid of these again. And now you can see this actually tracks the level of this audio file. And you can do this on any track and then map this to whatever parameter you want. So I'm going to go back here and rename this vocal to be level. And let's go back here, click map, go back here and click level. So now we have the level of the track that we can map to any parameter we want. I'm going to map that to our dimmer. And let's change that range to be more subtle, maybe like 0.8. It's subtle, but it does add some nice reactivity. Another device that you can use is LFO. We can drop that in here, and this creates a nice LFO signal that can be synced to our BPM. So let's change the rate to be based on BPM and go down to a half note. And now we can map this. I'm going to create a new macro called LFO half. And let's map it to that. Again, the reason why I'm going through the macros is that it has a much better interface for changing the min and max. If you just map directly to these parameters from the Max for Live device, you have to track it down and change it in here. So I prefer to leave these as is and just work through the macros. Now I'm going to map this LFO to our camera translate X, and we can get a little back and forth motion. And I might want to change the depth of this LFO so it's a little bit more subtle. And of course, this depth is also something you could automate. So you can go really deep down a rabbit hole with these various control modulation devices. So we've got all these macros set up to automate these things. Something you might want to do at some point is record the value of those macros into automation lanes. And this is what makes this little M button so powerful. Usually you can't do this in Ableton. You're either stuck with macro or automation. So the first step is to make sure this button right here is turned on. That's what allows you to record automation. And now I can go to the start and hit record. It looked a little glitchy while it was happening, but what we've done is actually recorded all of those macros into automation lanes. So now I can click on Camera Translate X and see this automation here. If I unmap from LFO 1/2, we can now revert to automation. And something you'll probably want to do here is highlight, right click, simplify envelope. And now you've got this nice LFO automation that you can kind of customize in various ways. Like maybe we want to stretch it up, and this is something you can't do with the macro, right? So the workflow I generally recommend is like start with the macros, experiment, see what works, and then when you really got something you want, record that into automation, and then you can fine tune it for the final product. So the last thing I want to show you is how you can incorporate recording into the mix. So let's say I want to work with this lead motion sensor, which is something you can't really do in Ableton. I'm going to show the network here. I've already got it set up in TouchDesigner, so I've got these two channels that I want to use to control the visual. I'm going to map this one to Camera Translate Y and this one to TZ. Now I've got this expressive camera movement based on the lead motion data. So what I can do is actually record those changes coming from TouchDesigner while I'm playing back the rest of the automation. So you can kind of really powerfully target particular parameters to perform with and record while the rest are still playing. So I'm going to work with these two parameters, and I'm going to turn off output for them. And then I'm going to hold shift and turn off input for all of them, but just leave it on for these two. Now, when I update in TouchDesigner, you'll see that these are being changed, but the rest will not be changed by anything, and they'll output to TouchDesigner. So now I can go to the beginning here, hit this record button, and record this lead motion data into the automation lanes.
Can't keep playing, don't make me say it.
So So now we can go to these automation sections. I'm going to turn on output, and let's disable these expressions here. Now I can play this back and it'll be exactly as if I were using the lead motion.
Can't keep playing.
So something I would definitely want to do here is right click, simplify envelope on both of these guys. Hopefully that shows you how powerful this system can be. You can really mix and match recording and automating. You can send any sort of signal into this device via OSC, record it, simplify it, and then start to really dial it in and change this automation for your final version. Another thing I want to show you is how you might use this timeout feature. This is really handy for synchronizing video playback. So one of the outputs of OSC Manager is called out Ableton. The other one, just for reference, is out parameters, and that contains just a chop with all the incoming OSC parameters. But this first one has a few different channels in it, and they correspond to the Ableton timeline. So if I start playing here, you'll see this time update, and note that time is in relation to this first marker. So if I go back to here, it's at 0. What you can do now is use this time feature to synchronize movie playback. So I'm going to go into an example. I have an input in this component here. I'm going to create a new movie file in, and I'm just going to choose one of these sample count videos and plug this in here. I've already set up my network, so I'm just going to show this on top in the 4 corners, just as an example. But what you can do now is change this to specify index. So first I want to change the unit to be seconds, because that's what Ableton is outputting in. And then I'm going to drag Ableton time onto the index. And now this is going to be perfectly synced with the Ableton timeline. So it's going to start at 0. If I pause here, it'll be paused. When you're creating a music video and you want some sort of video content, you can totally synchronize it to this timeline using this technique. Something you might want to do, which is what I've done in the past, is I export just this little section of the song I'm working with. You bring that into a video editor, edit whatever video you want to be played during your generative music video, export it, bring it into TouchDesigner, set up the index as so. Now you have a video that is perfectly synced with your timeline and automation. Now I want to talk about how you can export your final automated videos. So there's a couple main ways to do this. One is in real time using OBS Studio, and that's what I'm using to record right now, so I can't really show you. In TouchDesigner, you can add a new siphon spout output to that. In OBS Studio, you can get a spout plugin and create a new spout input here, and it should show the new TouchDesigner patch. I'm going to hide it because I'm recording the tutorial, so it's getting a little confusing. But the nice thing about this is you can also include desktop audio. So I'll just show you if I play the song. That's actually recording the output from Ableton as well. If you're using Synesthesia, this is definitely the way I would recommend doing it. You can go to Live Sources and Settings, turn on Spout Output, and record in OBS Studio. It is possible in TouchDesigner to record in non-real time and get a really high quality rendered output that doesn't depend on your CPU or GPU maintaining a good FPS. The way to do that is to create a movie file out and plug this in here. I'm going to change the video codec to be H.264, but you can use whatever sort of video codec you like to use. So this handles the video output. There's a couple options for audio. One is to just record the video output and then add it in post in whatever video editing software you use. But I'm going to show a different way as well, which is to export the audio from Ableton between your in and out markers. I'm going to save it in our project folder. Then I'm going to bring that file into here. Side note, if you're not using this software everything on Windows, you should be. It's an amazing way to search for all your files. So for this audio, we want to set it to locked to timelines. I'm going to drag this into the audio chop for a movie file out. Now we're going to use the TouchDesigner timeline to basically sync the Ableton timeline. So what we need to do is extend the range here so that there's enough space to fit the whole track. Doesn't really matter how long it is. So let's just set it to like 10,000 or something. That should be long enough for our video. All right, let's choose a name for this. We'll say OSC Automator demo. And now here's the trick. You can pause it, go back to start here, turn off real time so that this is going to properly render each frame. And now what we do is go to our OSC manager, turn on output time, and turn on time over here. Make sure that's turned on. So now if I press play in TouchDesigner, you'll see the playhead in Ableton stays sync, and all the automation is sending over to TouchDesigner and updating it, but it's happening not in real time. So the next step is to open up our movie file out, hit record here, and then just press play. All right, now we can turn off record here. So now if I go to the project folder and I pull up this new .mov, we should have the final output complete with synchronized audio.
Can't keep playing.
Not the greatest animation here, but hopefully it gives you a sense of how you can use this tool. All right, folks, that's it. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out download links in the description for OSC Automator, as well as all the example files. And if you make anything cool with this, please let me know. I'd love to check it out.